All right, today we're talking about the design argument. The design argument goes way back. There's lots of different forms of it. It's still got defenders today. We should note that it's different than the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument argues from the mere fact that the world exists and says, well, there's got to be a cause of its existence. The design argument looks at the particular features of this world, and particularly at its orderly composition, and says, there must have been a designer or architect for it. So it's not just about the mere existence of the world, it's about the source of its design in particular. Now, there's a couple different forms of the design argument that we're going to look at, but in this video, we're going to start with the form that David Hume presents and critiques in his very famous book, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And this book is written as a fictional dialogue between three characters. And for our purposes, the two important ones are Cleanthes, who's going to defend the design argument, and Philo, who's going to criticize it. Demia is just there for different purposes. So here's how the argument basically goes down that Cleanthes wants to make. The first premise says this: the parts of the world, if you look around at the world, all function as means that are adapted to certain ends. Now, when I say the world here, I mean everything that exists in the cosmos. I'm not just talking about planet Earth. And the point is that when you look around, you see that all the parts work together to achieve certain outcomes, certain goals. So for example, when you look at a leaf, those microscopic parts all work together to create chloroplast. Through photosynthesis, it turns sunlight and carbon dioxide into oxygen and nutrients for the tree. And the tree is part of an ecosystem that all works together. And the ecosystem is part of a planet, and the planet is in its orbits and maintaining gravitational equilibrium and so forth with the rest of the galaxy. So it all looks like everything in this universe is part of a big, giant machine, which is all functioning in an astonishingly well-ordered way. Now, do you know what else functions in a well-ordered way? Stuff that humans make. Take, for example, a watch, or my smartphone, or your computer, or even something much simpler. You could take a house, the parts of a house. Humans create objects where the parts all work together to achieve certain outcomes. And that's what premise 2 is saying. Human minds produce artifacts. An artifact is just something that humans make. And in those artifacts, the means work together for certain ends. And if you take premises 1 and 2 together, you'll see that premise 3 follows as a sub-conclusion from them. The world resembles an artifact. The universe looks like the kind of thing that humans make, except on a bigger scale. In both of them, the parts work together to accomplish certain goals. Now, at this point, we've achieved this very important premise, number 3, and Hume introduces number 4. Similar effects have similar causes. Now, you'll be familiar with this because we discussed this. It's called the uniformity principle. We discussed it when we were talking about a problem of induction. And Hume's point is that, look, anytime we make inferences about where things came from that we don't see, or what happened when we weren't looking, or what's going to happen tomorrow, we're assuming that causes have the same effects all the time, and that things work in predictable ways. So when you see, if I've dropped an egg off the top of my house for 10 consecutive days, well, that cause is going to have the same effect today as it did for the last 10 days. If I see an egg splattered on the sidewalk, I can infer with a lot of certainty that that happened because it fell from a great height. That's a common sense principle. It's fairly non-controversial. But when you take that together with premise 3, look where that lands us. The world came from somewhere, the universe. It's an effect of some kind, it appears. And it very much resembles another effect, that is cell phones and houses and things that humans make. Now, if those effects are similar, then they must have similar causes. Now, what's the cause of the artifact? Well, we know what the cause of the artifact is. We've seen that. It's a mind, a human mind. Well, if the world, the cosmos, has a similar cause to this similar effect, then the world also must have been caused by something very much like a human mind. And there we have it. The world was caused by a big mind, a designer, an intelligent designer, who intended for all the parts of the universe to fit together as they do. Now, I hope you feel the mojo of this argument. The design argument is one that Hume spends a lot of time discussing, I think precisely because he finds it profoundly, intuitively appealing in many ways. And he realizes the power that it has when we really think about the features of the natural world around us. However, he's not here to praise the argument, but to bury it. And so he's going to raise some criticisms in the voice of Philo. Now, here's the basic direction of the criticisms that Philo wants to make. He wants to agree with premises 3 and 4, sort of, but he wants to nuance them. And the nuances are going to be crucial. So premise 3 said the world resembles an artifact. The universe is kind of like my cell phone. And Philo wants to say, yeah, that's true to an extent, to a small extent, but the world doesn't resemble a human artifact very closely. The differences are enormous. And then the same goes for premise 4. Similar effects have similar causes. And Philo says, yes, of course, but that's only true when the degree of resemblance between those effects is very high, only when the resemblance is close. And in the case of the world and an artifact, the resemblance, he says, is not close. So where does that leave us? Here's the argument he's making. The more distant the resemblance is between two effects, the less probable it is that their causes resemble each other. But the resemblance between the universe and any human artifact, for example, a house or my cell phone, is pretty distant. There's some resemblance, but it's small. Therefore, it is improbable, it is unlikely that the cause of the universe resembles a human mind. And so the argument fails. Now, this corollary, premise 1 here, which Philo lays down, why would anybody think that? Well, he gives us some illustrations to try to motivate this premise here. Let's say that a surgeon has operated on 10,000 human patients, and every time she's found that they have blood circulating in the same way. Now, based on those past observations, how sure can she be that she's going to find a similar circulatory system in the next item that she cuts into? Well, plausibly, it all depends on how similar that item is to the other ones that she's already seen. So if it's another human is 100% similar to the past 10,000 cases that she's observed. But she can be 100% certain that there's going to be a similar circulatory system inside that human. What about a dog, though? Dogs are a little bit like humans, maybe even mostly, let's say. But the 40% differences between us are significant. So there's let's say a dog is 40% like a human. That means I can only 60% like a human. That means I can only be 60% confident that there's going to be a human-like circulatory system inside the dog. So what about a tree? A tree is a little bit like a human. When all's going well with them, they both stand upright on the ground. But the differences here are huge. Let's say 75% different. That means that she can only be 25% confident there's anything like a circulatory system inside a tree. And with a rock, the odds are real slim. So everything here depends upon how similar are the cases to past observation. So the big differences that Philo finds between the universe and between human artifacts like cell phones, watches, houses, there's a few big differences. First of all, the universe is a whole. Artifacts are just tiny parts of that whole. Humans and the stuff that they make are just little tiny bits of the universe. And what's true of the whole is not necessarily true of each and every one of the parts. Furthermore, when we look at how humans make artifacts, we're looking at the operation of one of the parts of the universe once the universe is already in existence. But then we're trying to use that to make an inference about the total origin of the universe as a whole. So there's a difference between wholes and their parts. There's a difference between origins and operations of these items. And then finally, there's a difference in materials. So the materials that compose human artifacts, like say a house, it's a fairly limited range. You got bricks, stones, mortar, stuff like that. The universe includes that plus a whole lot more. So these differences, says Hume, are very significant when it comes to making predictions about their causes and their effects. So he says, look, we wouldn't make this kind of inference in any other case. We wouldn't think it was justified. For example, we can't infer from observing the growth of a hair on your arm that a human being originates in in a similar way. You know, the hair on your arm is just one part of an organism. The way that it grows is just the operation of one part of the organism. But when you're talking about where the whole organism comes from in the first place, you're talking about the entire reproductive process. That's just an entirely different case, and you can't. The parallels there are very slim. We cannot infer from the way a leaf blows in the wind, that is how part of an organism operates, that trees, that is the whole organism, originates in some kind of parallel way. Again, it's apples and oranges when you're talking about the operation of parts versus the origin of the whole. And by the same token, we cannot infer from the way that humans, who are just parts of the universe, produce artifacts. That is how they operate on existing materials. We can't infer that the universe as a whole was produced in a similar way from a similar cause. So none of these afford us very plausible inferences at all. They might afford us very slim, unlikely cases, but not good ones. So Hume might concede, yeah, the universe, I guess, is a little tiny bit like an artifact made by a master craftsman. But you know what? It's also a little bit like an animal that originates from coitus. Also a little bit like a vegetable, which comes from seeds. It's a little bit like the 10th attempt of a poor apprentice craftsman to make some machine. It might even be a little bit like the joint project of 10 craftsmen collaborating. His point is that the universe is not any more similar to a human artifact than it is to any of these other effects. And if it's not, then there's an equally good and equally bad case for any of these kind of analogical accounts of the origin of the universe. None of them are very good, even if all of them are sort of conceivable. All right, a few points as we wrap up. I'm not going to try to, make a verdict on the argument for you, but here's some things to ponder. First of all, how similar do you think the universe is to an artifact? I mean, and is the question here about more than just like degrees of similarity? Are there certain aspects of similarity that are more important than others that should count more when it comes to making an inference? And then secondly, what about this whole business about similar effects and causes? Now, according to Hume and according to Cleanthes' argument, similar effects have similar causes. Do you think that's true? I mean, if it's not true, then Cleanthes' argument collapses. On the other hand, Hume has already pointed out that there's no non-circular argument for it. What about Hume's nuanced version of it, that the more distant the resemblances between the effects, the less probable the resemblance is between their causes? Is that true? Is it even possible to quantify or compare degrees of similarity in the necessary way here? On the other hand, if we reject 1 and 2, if we reject these kind of uniformity principles and their correlates, then on what basis can we make any inferences about events that we haven't directly observed? Worry about all that. Think about it. If you find the answers. All right, we'll talk about the other version of the design argument in our next video.